In 1996, I showed up for a master's degree in McGill University's music program in Montreal. I had just spent a year in New York studying and recording and learning like crazy. That learning stayed as intense as it had been in New York City when I got to my first guitar lessons in Montreal with the great Rody Ellias. He introduced me to improvising practice techniques that I still use over 15 years later. He also introduced me to a lot of great music, like Stravinsky and Goreski. Rody's is an incredibly wide musicianship. He was, as a very young man, playing all over his native Ottawa and Montreal, often at the Chateau Laurier's long-running jazz series with visiting stars from the US and Canada. He studied jazz with the legendary guitarist Pat Martino, and then later went back to school and studied classical composition. He writes beautifully and keeps as busy as any jazz musician I know, while also teaching for Ottawa's Carleton University. He also taught for years at Montreal's Concordia University and Nova Scotia's St. Francis Xavier University. I was in Ottawa to record my new album, Miniatures, and dropped by Rody's place. Unlike other interviews I've done, I felt no urge to edit this one. It seemed like such a nice, flowing conversation. Please enjoy the musical mind of one of Canada's very finest musicians, Rody Ellias. All right, here's my first question to you, Rody Ellias. 3 crucial pieces of music that you would recommend that any human being hear, and why?
Thanks for preparing me, Mike.
Go. Well, I don't know. It doesn't matter. I'm just as interested in the unprepared answer.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is the unprepared clavichord. So speaking of prepared and unprepared, the well-tempered clavier.
Yeah.
It's not prepared, but it's tempered.
Right.
The music in there is like, to me, sublime, right? Both books, Bach's well-tempered clavier. I mean, I'm not even thinking about this.
No, that's good.
I'm just saying that because the book's right there, and I'm struggling through some of it on the guitar.
Really? You play that stuff on the guitar?
Well, I try to.
Good God Almighty.
And that's where it all. And again, we don't want to go on a tangent, but that's why I tell people I'm a sort of frustrated piano player. In ways I wish I would have stuck with the piano that I gave up when I was 5.
Okay.
Anyway, Bach. Well, so much music by Bach. I mean, how can you not include Bach in the top 3 hit parade?
Yeah.
And the violin partitas and sonatas. And interestingly, if you read Paul Galbraith's little liner notes in the recording he made. Paul Galbraith is a classical guitarist. He's originally from England, I believe, but he lives in Brazil, and he's part of the Brazilian guitar quartet. And he plays what he calls a Haydn guitar, which is an 8-string guitar. So because he too is a frustrated pianist. He hears piano so well, and he wanted to play this music on the guitar.
Right.
So he has this 8-string fan fret instrument that gives him an extra high note, an extra low note, so he plays all these.
Okay, so to back up for the benefit of not just of the listeners who don't know what that is, but for me who doesn't know it, I've seen fanned frets on an instrument before.
Yeah.
What do they do? What does that accomplish?
They're just angled differently. Instead of being perpendicular to the fretboard, they're angled such that because
they kind of spread out like the sun's rays,
exactly
emanating from a source that would be off the guitar.
Exactly, and one of the reasons is because that the shorter the string, the higher the pitch. If it's the same, if you take 2 strings the same thickness, and if you make one shorter, it's going to be higher pitch.
Right.
So the way these guitars are constructed are the higher pitch strings are actually shorter, and the lower pitch strings are longer.
Okay.
I mean, obviously the thickness of the string comes into it as well, right?
Yeah.
But then because the higher strings are shorter and the lower strings are longer, if you go directly across the fretboard, you're going to get some funny sounds. So you angle it in such a way that the proportions are still the same on the high strings as on the low strings. So you have to sort of angle it towards the
Okay,
the high
so
string.
those fan fret guitars also have staggered string lengths, so that the highest sounding strings are literally shorter?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so the nut, I mean, I can show you visually, but
Yeah.
the nut goes like that, and this string will be shorter and this string will be longer.
Okay, so like the bottom fret, the lowest fret, the furthest one from the rest of the guitar, is also on an
farther
angle.
away. Yeah.
And that that changes the relative lengths of the strings. And
Yeah.
so those fan frets is in response to that. So I'm sorry, that was a tangent, but I've
it's
always
okay.
wondered about those goddamn things.
Yeah.
So
that allows him to play. So he gets the higher pitch string and the lower pitch string. So it gives him a wider range.
Okay.
Which is what the piano can do that guitarists can't do. So I think he originally designed it to play the music of Haydn because he loved the Haydn piano music. I could be wrong, but anyway, he's recorded like Debussy's, like some of the children's pieces.
A lot of piano music.
Incredible that he gets this on the guitar. And then he recorded the full violin partitas and sonatas, all of them.
All of it.
All of them. And the reason I'm getting to him is because he says he sees the whole, all six, there's three partitas and three sonatas, so 6 pieces of music, which each have, 4 to 6 or so movements in each one.
Right.
And he sees it all as one piece.
Right.
And all related to, religion and the resurrection of Christ.
That would make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, especially because it's Bach, right?
Yeah.
Who was extremely religious.
I was just going to ask you that. Historically, do we know just how Lutheran he was, just how much of a Christian Bach was? I mean, it doesn't seem to me like he could have afforded to be much of anything beyond a musician, because the output he's responsible for is staggering, right?
I read once that if somebody hired a modern day copyist just to copy out the music that he wrote for 8 hours a day, it would take more than a lifetime just to copy it out.
Right, and one of the theories now that makes sense.
Yeah.
One of the theories I've heard is that maybe his wife,
wife and children, were little elves.
Some things have like his name on it, even though. And then also in that day, people learned a lot of how to write by copying scores.
As
you
did.
You just got used to what seeing good counterpoint would look like by looking at a hell of a lot of it.
He used to stay up at night and copy Buxtehude scores under the candlelight.
Really?
Yeah.
So maybe his kids were doing the same thing.
Maybe.
And maybe some of it was more compositional, or his wife.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I'm not really a historian. There are a lot of books written about it.
You have a look at that handwriting of his, and it certainly looks like he was going in a hurry.
Yeah, for sure. But I have read a very interesting book on his approach to writing. I mean, it's all speculative, right?
Yeah.
But this is a extremely logical. It makes a lot of sense to me. I forget who the author is. I picked it up about actually. Well, one of the last times I was in New York, so over 4 or 5 years ago, at the Juilliard bookstore, and it just sort of the title grabbed me. Anyway, it was this person's thesis is that when Bach was writing, so I know we're getting way off on a tangent.
No, it's good. I love it.
Still
I'm
on
just
number
keeping
one.
eye. That's a good question. It's a fruitful one.
His thesis is that the way he thought that Bach most likely approached writing a piece of music was Bach would get an idea, which we all do. We start with an idea, right? Mm-hmm. But then he would take it through everything. He would see, well, does invertible counterpoint work with this? What does invertible counterpoint mean to the non-musician? It means, counterpoint means 2 melodies at the same time, or 2 or more melodies at the same time. Mm-hmm. Note against note, point against point. So let's just talk about two-part counterpoint, where you have a melody in the top and a melody in the bottom. And we've all heard that. And they're both going along. They're both melodic, but they both work harmonically. Mm-hmm. So that's counterpoint. Invertible counterpoint is if you take the bottom line and you put it on top, or the bottom and the top line and put it on bottom, and it still works harmonically.
It still makes harmonic sense. It still adds up to a type of sound that would sound satisfying to the listener's ear, and not like, oh, he's turned something upside down and now it doesn't work.
Yeah. So that's one so-called developmental technique.
Right.
So he'd take it through all the developmental techniques that was at his disposal. That was one. Another one was called sequencing. So you take a melody, do 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 do, take it through, started on different
parts of the scale,
and so on, and different parts of harmony and so on. Sequencing, stretto, which is like counterpoint, but really close to counterpoint is imitative. One usually comes after the other. Do 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 dee do dee da da do 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 dee do dee da da. Right,
a little bit like a round,
but then stretto is like do 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 do.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
One very close. So he'd take it through all these techniques, and then he'd say, "Well, what are the possibilities of this musical idea that I just came up with?"
Right.
And he'd take it through all. So once he knew what it was capable of doing, then he'd sit down and write the piece.
So this is like, and so
that's
it's only
according
worth,
to this
only
scholar.
worth doing if it'll admit of a certain amount of flexibility, or if it takes you to some interesting places when you do these. And I imagine in that list would also include retrograde, like turning it backwards, turning it upside down.
Yeah, turning it upside down for sure.
You know what this reminds me of? Like I might be remembering this wrong, but in like computer science, they talk about bounded problems and unbounded problems. It takes something that seems like it'll just be a wide open blue sky thing, like a melody. Well, it could be anything.
Yeah.
And he's trying to translate something that's wide open into something that's, no, you can boil this down to a set of possibilities that are huge, but still finite. They're not,
right.
And so you're turning it into like a chess game.
Yeah.
Here are the possible moves that could be made with that melody in eighth notes, if with a rest right here. Then you can turn it upside down this way, that way, this, and within a certain discrete number of steps that those are the possibilities.
Yeah.
The only ways that you're going to solve that little crossword puzzle, at least, and then if half a dozen of them are, and then when you try that, you get a bunch of stuff that you don't care if you never hear it again.
Yeah.
In fact, you mostly get that.
Yeah.
And then
you pick and choose.
You get the one or two.
Yeah.
And I always wondered about this when they gave us this in theory courses, because it always seemed to me that the implication was that the listener is subconsciously somehow cued into, oh, well, that's just the same melody, but turned upside down, you see.
Yeah.
It seemed to me that there was a kind of latent, like an unstated psychological theory about the listener that I never actually personally, it doesn't matter whether I bought it, but I was young. I'm more interested in where it takes you. I don't even care if it's that. I don't care that much whether the listener is scanning for these other levels of organization. But I always wondered, well, could you just take one thing and then put a totally unrelated melody against it, and it's still going to be beautiful? In which case, what's the value in putting the melody against itself? It seems like there's a certain well, it's integrated to itself. But that's a certain type of fixating on one property of that melody.
Yeah.
But if nothing else, it shows you that what's going on intellectually with this guy. So it's like what it reminds me is what I don't think I made this term up, but I don't know where I got it. It's a very Western thing, and it's a rage for unity.
Yeah.
You know? Like the same thing that wants us to have like an essay be laid out really elegantly. He states this thesis, and then he brings out the counterintuitive implication of it, and then explores that, and then sums it up by it's the same kind of wanting the work to have the same level of integration.
And the first point you brought up about whether you hear the retrograde or not, you hear whether the listener perceives it or not. I mean, there are two kinds of listeners. There's the educated musical. I hate to use that word.
There's the initiated,
and just the general listener who's not really listening on a technical level. And then what you're saying is, on a subconscious level, I guess the uninitiated would just perceive it like know that there's something there that's giving it unity without really being able to identify
knitting it together.
But the sort of trained musical ear would maybe be able to identify it. I think for me, that's one of the things. I've always had a little bit of a problem of using something that's clever intellectually, but it's not perceived if you're looking for it, if you're listening for it.
Right.
Right. So another thing I love about Bach, when he turns a melody upside down, you can hear it. You can actually hear it as the upside down melody.
It's clear that he's making a comment on the right side up version of it. But that's
aesthetics, right? But Keith Jarrett. Speaking of Keith Jarrett, who probably one of the three things. I don't know which Keith Jarrett. Maybe just the way he plays "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." It's just like it comes from somewhere over the rainbow.
So what I'm going to do is pause us here because I've learned that if I do this in one continuous chunk, it's hell to edit.
Okay.
We'll be right back. So Keith Jarrett was number 2.
Okay, was
another of the 3?
I mean, probably he would have been. I don't know, number 2, number 3. I'm not sure we're putting them in order.
Oh, it's not a.
But he would have been included, and
it's understood too. There's about 28 things that easily could have been in the 3.
Yeah. So the reason, I mean, he came up in the conversation because we're talking about unity, and I mean, one of the ways unity was, has been developed is through what we call motivic development.
Yeah.
So you take an idea, da 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 da, da 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 da, and the whole symphony, all 4 movements are based on those notes, that phrase, or that what do you call it, motif.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of music, it's sort of a very what we call a Germanic idea, the motivic development. So Bach was big on that, Beethoven, Schoenberg, and so on, taking an idea, and it's with us today. I remember Ralph Towner, when I get to meet him years ago, he came out to where I was teaching at St. FX, and I got him to come out and do a concert and a workshop for people. Yeah. And that stuck in my mind. He was telling the kids about how a piece is developed. He says that, well, the first idea, everything is, I'm just paraphrasing, everything comes from the first idea. So it's basically the DNA or the seed of the rest of your piece. Right. Everything is generated from that. And that's the very traditional European Western way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And in a way, too, it's sort of a way, disguised differently. It's the sort of way I think Indian melodies are developed.
Oh, yeah?
Well, they don't think of it as a motif. I mean, they have ragas and phrases and things, and well, it's developed differently, but they definitely have development techniques. So everything is generated from the raga you're in, and the time, the tala, the time cycle, and but Keith Jarrett. Well, I think it was maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. He came out with a record, and I forget what it was called. And I remember his liner notes said, "Trust me." He says, "You're not going to hear motivic development in this, but trust me to let the music's going to take you somewhere." So his modus operandi is what he was trying to do was play music, spontaneously improvised music, but not have it not develop out of a particular motif.
Like just a deliberate escape from...
Yeah, just like a continuum that changes all the time.
Right.
And one thing leads to another. But, I mean, Bach can be like that too, but underneath it all there is something holding it together. But what he was trying to do was not have that thing hold it together. Just like, I'm not sure how successful that was. I'd have to go back and listen to it again.
But I can think of all kinds of music that would seem to me to be, you could almost characterize them that way, and that they were quite successful. But I mean, I could totally be wrong.
So-called through composed, right?
Yeah, or things where, what's going on in the accompaniment part, it's just there for some kind of textural reason. It's there for some kind of support. There's no real, like, I don't know, say Eric Satie.
Right.
Where this is not this one little 2-beat long germ that we're now going to see how it grows into this and effloresces into variations on itself. It's this long theme and then it goes to a different part.
Right.
And then, you know what I mean? It doesn't, it's not as, Don't get me wrong. I love that about Bach and about actually all the European music of that couple of centuries where you hear it. And that's when they forced us in my bachelor's degree at McGill. They forced us to do all 3 years of legit theory. Great. And it was great. It was really good. I fought it for the first year or two and then figured out, no, this is wonderful. But it wasn't until I took that I heard it that way. That I, so for example, like the middle course was probably the one that really drove this home. It was sonata form analysis. And so to sort of break that down for anybody listening in, you could liken it exactly to what I was saying before about an essay. That you have a theme that you stated at the beginning, and then you have a counterpoint to the theme. You have a what do they call it? Not a counter subject, but
counter melody.
Yeah. You had a main theme type, and then you had a subordinate theme type. And often, like if it's a straight sonata form, then the second theme, the first time it's introduced, will be over in this other key.
Right.
And then they'll go through they'll break the theme down into smaller chunks and see what the implications are for putting one part against another and explore the implications of one or two notes in the original theme, one or two little pieces. And then when they feel like they've really worked out some of the implications of the theme, then they come back, they restate the original theme in the first key, and now the secondary theme comes back either in the same key, or if it was in minor, then it comes back up in the relative major, right? Which seems like some kind of initial juxtaposition that was brought up, some kind of tension between those two themes has now been worked through.
It's the tension's resolved.
Yeah, it's like some kind of marriage counseling in the... catharsis is probably the right... Because that's an Aristotelian idea about drama, right? Like you're going to work through a problem as stated in the outset. I absolutely love that. But if I hadn't had to take those courses, but I guarantee you, at least with my conscious mind, I was nowhere near perceiving that these pieces were organized like this.
That's what I like about that approach to music is, and if I can just speak about myself for a second, I mean, that's what I sort of aspire to. Like, if I'm writing a piece of music to be improvised on, I'm not writing it from a point of view of a series of chord changes that you're going to improvise on, but I want to improvise on the melodic ideas and generate different chords from the melodic ideas, and that's what the classical and the romantic and a lot of I guess particularly, especially the romantic composers did, was they had their theme, and then they didn't stick to a chord progression, but they let the theme. Okay, where will this theme go, and how can we different length phrases and everything. Yeah, that's what fascinates me a lot, and I think that's what I like about Keith Jarrett's solo improvisations. Yeah, is he takes a melodic idea and he develops it, not worrying about the harmonic progression so much, but yes, he's worrying about harmony, but he's letting the melody lead the way and the harmony's coloring it. Yeah. So the harmony can change, or the phrase lengths can change, but what can this little melodic idea do? Like what we get out of, like what we get in so many classical musics. So to back it up for the non-initiate musician, we're kind of talking about two different frames of reference here. One is you see some improvising jazz musicians up on stage. They have a basic structure of the tune. And the way I have relatives who will say to me, how do you know when all to come back in together at the same time? Right? Which, when you're used to being in the subculture, the question makes us laugh, right? Yeah. Because it's the way we know. The short answer is that some version of 1 minute has gone by. Like we're tracking a form that's going by. Like if your whole job was just to sit there and sing "Happy Birthday to You," and at the and over and over and over again, and never take the never stop in between. So, happy birthday, happy birthday, happy birthday to you.
happy birthday, you start over.
Yeah.
You always know that where one of those creases is where the tune starts over again. So this is a repeating form, and that, in short, is how we know when to come back in together with each other. And what Roddy's talking about is that these, I think, if I can paraphrase you, is that where in standard improvisation you can count on this sort of clockwork thing, this treadmill going by to telegraph to you, but at the same time it hems you in for how long phrases can be. They can't go past. Things can't go past that, well, not without some serious surgery or subtlety, that the beginning of the next form. It's very much being described by that form, and that's great. It opens up all kinds of doors. It allows people who have never met each other to play together with each other and say things. There's all kinds of stuff it allows for, all kinds of games you can play with that, with the expectation that you'll start over, but the phrase stretched on. There's all kinds of great stuff that falls out of that. But what you don't get to do is just suddenly everybody in the band just ignores where in the structure of Happy Birthday to You, and somehow it still works.
Yeah, that's it's a lot more difficult, especially, I mean, it's one thing to do it solo, and then it's another thing to do it with a duo, and then the more people you add,
it becomes intractable.
It's like a conversation, right? It's just like, it's easy. It's a lot easier to have a conversation with two people. As soon as you add a third people, then you get more, and the listening part, there's more to listen to, there's more to negotiate. Yeah, more back and forth. But there's a general rule that I like to follow, and it comes from drama, like the drama improvisers, and their first rule is say yes to your partner. Say yes, right? Right. So that's very important. That sounds like something from like theater sports or something like. Yeah, it's from theater improvisation. Right. Say yes to your partner. So I mean, it's very important in music. But the other part about it, so it's more difficult almost. I think it's extremely difficult to say the way Keith Jarrett does a solo improvisation, to get a whole group doing that. I heard Canadian musicians. I noticed how I put the plug in for Canadian musicians, because we so tend to focus on the great Americans, but we've got some incredible musicians here. Yeah. Phil Nimmons, who just turned 92 the other day, yes, and David Braid. I heard them last year here in Ottawa at the National Arts Centre, playing music to photographs. David, a photographer that David had met, wow, and who did the album cover, the photo for that great big mega CD that David and Phil made. And they were just making up music together. But the thing that was so beautiful about it was tonal music that we're making up. They were going. So it had definite chord changes. You cannot BS in that. Like you got to really listen and really understand where the other person's going. Yeah. And it's takes a lot of work, a lot of experience and a lot of maturity and everything. It was so beautiful to hear. On top of, like, you develop a massive harmonic language, a chord language that you recognize when you hear it. Yeah. So when the one guy hears the other guy, I see, he's gone diminished with that harmony. Exactly. I'll do this. That, and then past that, you got to just get to know the actual person. And it's like, I wonder if he'll do X or Y, or, my God, he did Z. I've never heard him do Z. What do I do about that? And, well, that comes from, I mean, that I learned years ago from two people. Jean Baudin, who's a piano player that I grew up with here in Ottawa. He moved to Montreal years ago. And the great Nelson Simons. Both of them, when I was young, they were very big on, got to have a group. Right. And it made so much sense. I mean, that's how all the great music happened. The Miles Davis group with Wayne Shorter and Ron Carter and Herbie Hancock, and they played together for a few years, and the music grew out of them knowing each other and being able to get lost together and being able to not show that you were lost, and music came out of it. I mean, if you listen to some of those records, I mean, they're getting lost. There are places, and there are places, but you don't because they're listening so much. They're just saying yes to each other. Yeah. It sort of doesn't matter too. Like doesn't matter, because that whole second question of this person and their tendencies and how much I value them, that you can gloss through on that
just even as a technical question, like it's the texture doesn't dissolve because they know each other.
Yeah.
And then it kind of resolves and here's beat one of If I Were a Bell on Plug Nickel. I remember that's one place where it happens where Ron and Tony go into one of those dotted quarter figures, and after a while it's not quite together anymore.
Somebody zigged when they should have zagged.
It's so nice.
But you go with it. The worst, I mean, for me, the most uncomfortable musical situation is if somebody's on the bandstand and and somebody makes a mistake or does something incorrectly or takes the wrong, and another musician says, "No, this is where we are."
This is where we are. Yeah,
it's
right.
a different mindset. Like,
yeah. No, there's
or a singer. If you're backing a singer, I mean, you've got to. Sometimes a singer might, decide to do something, and you've got to go with that.
Yeah. They are right.
Yeah.
And that's the power of the lyric too.
Yeah.
And that's if you've decided that they got away from where the quarter note was, they got off by a beat or whatever, the words will now render them correct.
Exactly.
Like, you're done, son.
Yeah.
Don't try and
Well, for some musicians, some non-singers, that's important too. Like, the famous story of Ben Webster, why did you stop playing? I forgot the words.
Wow, I never heard that one before. That's awesome. So now you had the Well-Tempered Clavier.
Yeah.
You referenced Somewhere Over the Rainbow. You talked about Keith Jarrett.
Well, it could be any of those beautiful solo, like the La Scala. That was incredible. Solo, unbelievable.
I've still never heard that one.
Oh, you got to hear it.
Keith Jarrett is live
Live
at,
solo improvisation. Yeah.
at La Scala in where's it, Milan or something like that? Really, eh? Oh my God.
I guess I'm giving myself away a bit with these choices, but
Quite pianistic.
pianistic and not necessarily mainstream jazz, which I love. But for me, that's just like one part of the whole spectrum of music and one little speck of the whole spectrum of life, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm just thinking hard now, but because you did broadside me with this question.
Yeah, I didn't. It should be noted.
Okay,
I didn't
so
prepare
can I make
in the least.
I think I'm going to make my third choice a grab bag.
Okay.
So the grab bag is going to include the music of one of my favorite. I'll say contemporary, but he died a number of years ago. Ligeti. One of my favorite composers, and especially, there's so much beautiful music he wrote.
Really, eh?
The piano studies are like 3 books of the piano studies. Also, there's there's so many phenomenal contemporary composers. Let's just keep it simple. Him, Indian music.
As a general,
this is part of the grab bag. The old standby Ravi Shankar and I'm just going blank. The sarod player Khan.
Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan.
No, it'll come to me in a sec. Ali Akbar Khan.
Okay.
Old school. Yeah.
Okay.
So beautiful. Just the way they play melodies. I mean, there's so much beautiful music in the world,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is something that
Wayne Shorter. Oh my God.
We could have done the whole interview practically just about Wayne Shorter.
Wayne Shorter.
Who, if he had never written a note, I find people don't talk about his playing a whole lot.
Yeah.
And it's just jaw-dropping.
Yeah.
The guy's playing.
Yeah. I wish I could understand it more than I do, but I try to reference him a lot if I'm teaching improv to a student, because often students, like, they're negotiating how to play melodies, hopefully melodies, on chord changes. And often they're looking at what's different from one chord to the next, right? So if you go from this chord 1 to chord 2, what note has changed? And well, that's the obvious thing. And then you want to zero in on that note to show the vertical
that you're
change.
Tracking. Yeah.
But I think what Wayne Shorter does a lot is he tries to find what notes are the same and lets the different notes color those notes.
Huh. Really?
Yeah. Well, I think. I mean, I don't know. That's what it seems like to me. Like he just plays little. His melodies are so simple and so they're almost like little nursery rhymes often, but on changes that aren't
all over the place.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the way of like when it's on that Mingus tune, "Goodbye Pork Pie Hat."
Yeah.
And the melody only really goes away from a blues scale.
It's just a blues scale,
2 or 3 times. But the changes it's the melody, the meaning of that melody keeps changing. Oh, here comes the guitar.
So,
let's hear it.
Right, so just like the blues melody, but the chords on it. Do da da do do dee da do 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 dee dee do da. They're not your typical blues changes, so they're coloring.
Yeah,
the coloring underneath.
And then when you go to play on the thing,
suddenly, they just play on the minor blues.
It's true. That's true.
Yeah.
They don't solo on that constantly moving carpet underneath.
I know
their
all
feet.
about that because I write tunes that if you tried to play on the chord changes, I mean, it just ends up.
The texture just becomes like this.
It becomes a straitjacket.
Yeah.
So you try to find an element that's what's essential in this chord, not so much what's specific about it.
Right. So far in the grab bag, we've got we had Wayne Shorter, we had
Ligeti. That's part of the grab bag. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just going through it. I like it.
Ali Akbar Khan. I love this composer Per Norgard, Norwegian composer. I don't know a lot of his music, but there's some really beautiful stuff that he's written. And speaking of, I know you're very interested in science and mathematics.
Love it.
I believe his the way he approaches music is through fractals or some kind of relationship to chaos theory and so on.
Man, I was talking to Dan Levitin the other day, and he was saying that I got to go look this up because one thing they did in the lab was this quantitative study on music through various periods in history. And they found that you could identify a time in history and even a composer according, I don't know how I can't wait to go check this out, but there was a certain mathematical formula that somehow related to the density of information, or it had to do with the rhythms in the music, and that you could, once you knew this formula, you could look at any piece blind, and sometimes right down to the composer say who it was on the basis of how it plugged into this formula, and that was fascinating to me. And, the nexus there between music and math. Well, that's
I mean, these theories of books have been written about using the Fibonacci series. How Bartók used it and how Debussy used it, and whether they knew about whether they were using it or not.
Yeah, I know. In Bartók's case, there, I can remember when we analyzed his music for celeste strings and percussion. There was a place exactly at the so-called golden mean through the piece, that number of beats into the piece, that the harmony was transposed a full tritone away from where it had begun. So, but the thing was, it was Bartók's students who discovered that relationship. He didn't say, "Hey, look what I put into this thing." Which I'm always suspicious of the golden mean stuff because it makes me think like, well, but then you can get heads I win, tails doesn't count. Every time the same moment comes up in another Bartók piece, and there is that's not where the denouement happened. Well, we just don't count that. It's got to occur more often than chance would predict.
Yeah.
In order for it, or it's got to be tied to some kind of unmistakable effect.
Yeah.
But still, I think, there's no question once those ideas get into composers' heads, there's sort of two questions. One is like, is this actually accounting in just a brute force, ground up scientific way for how people are conscious or unconsciously organizing their statements versus once because composers are pretty intellectual people. And so when they get these ideas, they just start using them for tools.
Right.
Hey, cool. I'll use that to write a tune.
Yeah.
And that's a horse of a different color because it may or may not. It sort of doesn't matter. Musicians will use anything.
A perfect example is the Schoenberg's 12-tone theory, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's not as theoretically mathematical. It's more arithmetic, sort of like 12 notes, and then you use them in this order, but it's very structured, very, very, very structured.
It's totally structured driven.
But in ways, like even Renaissance counterpoint was very structured, right? Because they targeted certain intervals on strong beats, like these are the intervals we'll target, and the same with Bach. He grew out of that, targeting specific intervals. And I mean, nobody really knows, back to Bach, nobody really knows how he thought, but there's obviously method there. Like there's a lot of method. When you study composition from Bach's time, or I guess after Bach's time, because as you said, a lot of people like that learned from just copying scores and everything. Mm-hmm. But, starting with like the Fuchs theories of, the book on counterpoint and so on. And people when they studied composition, they studied counterpoint.
Right.
They weren't studying how to be poetic about.
It wasn't a journey of self-discovery.
Yeah, it was. This is a craft, and the craft is lining up intervals, note interval against interval. This is how you do it.
Yeah.
One against two against three. It was very systematic.
Okay, so we went through a brief inventory of the greatest music ever in history, according to Roddy Elias.
Yeah, I probably left out something like Johnny Cash or something.
Yeah,
really important.
That's right.
Willie Nelson.
There's no way not to. I love Willie Nelson.
So do I. There's so much. I mean, it's like, what's your favorite star in the sky?
I know. It's such an unfair question.
What's your favorite flower in the field?
I ask these people these questions, and then the instant they ask me, I'm just, I don't know. Why would you ask me that?
Yeah.
But it's a projective test. It's like, what's the first thing pop into your head?
Yeah.
What do you automatically think of? What's on your mind these days?
Yeah.
So now I'm going to give a similar type of question about if you were just starting out to play an instrument, and you had your first couple of years, and you knew you'd have lots of time to commit to it. What would be the first few things you would tell somebody in that position to head for, in terms of what to work on?
I think train your ear.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are people born with so-called perfect pitch and so on, and there are people born that they think they're tone deaf, and there are people that have feel for rhythm. People that the ear to me is like I learned this in when I was at undergrad at Ottawa U. Mm-hmm. I did the solfege there for 3 years. I was actually exempt from it. But because I was I came from a different world. Like I was a jazz player until I was 30, and that's when I went to school. I didn't even know what solfege was, so I decided to take it anyway. And I'm so glad I did, because I learned so much. And what I learned
This solfege. In fact, I'm gonna ask you to define solfege for the benefit.
Well,
of the
also, I'm sorry. Solfege is the French or Italian solfeggio and French solfege system. And in India, it's they have their own solfege system. I forget what it's called, but it's basically singing, and training your ear through externalizing the sounds
through having to make the sounds.
Yeah,
and it kind of builds a map of do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and how melodies shake out of that.
Exactly. It's the same analogy as a painter, or a drawer, a
draftsman,
someone who draws sketches, needs to learn how to see. So like if I'm trying to draw something, like there's a plant over there behind you, Mike. If I tried to draw that, it would look horrible. But if I had a little more training than I do and see actually how to relate those three-dimensional lines into two-dimensional lines and then make them seem like three-dimensional, it's like training, then I've learned to see better.
So it allows you to become specific about the materials that you're interacting with.
Yeah, I mean, it allows you to become familiar with the tools. I mean, the most important tool for visual art, I think, the basic tool is seeing, and for music's an oral art. So,
right.
How many times do we... thank God I played the guitar before I went to high school, because, they stuck a tuba or a euphonium or something in my mouth and music in front of me and said, this note you press down here and you blow into this thing. And and then, so many people learn that way, and that's fine. And I'm sure you have, and I've met a lot of people who have, done like a lot of piano when they were young, and then they come to you when you're older and they say, I did my grade 10 piano or whatever, and I can't play a note.
What is that?
Well, it's because they learned by rote. They learned finger digital
strictly
reflex.
Is mechanical.
Yeah. So, to me, the ear is like, there's all different facets of the ear too. Like they're recognizing chords, recognizing notes, and everybody has different. People. Some people, like for example, my wife Sandra, is an untrained musician, but if and we've collaborated on I've set her text to music often, and sometimes she's put text to a melody that I say, could you? If I'll play her the melody once, maybe twice, she'll remember it.
She's got it.
She's got it. There are people like that really remember melodies. So people that remember intervals, people that, if you go, pardon me, if I go, I'll tell you the notes. I know people like that. Yeah.
Which note was missing from that cluster?
I did that with somebody. Anyway. So this class I was in, there were 3 levels at Ottawa U, and there was A, B, and C. I was in the A level. I was the only one in that class without perfect pitch. I had good pitch,
like a good way of faking it.
Good, yeah, and and I can sort of guess at it. But these people were like that. They all could
instant
but
recognition.
They had so many other weaknesses, right? Yeah. So many other weaknesses. Everybody has strengths. So what I'm saying is, like, okay, if you can do that, there are lots of different facets to training your ear. So I've sort of like, when I actually teach it now, it's something I started teaching my last few years at Concordia, and now I'm going to be doing it at Carleton. I find it so satisfying. I've broken it down to about 12 different things. So there's that kind of ear that remembers the melody. Yeah, that you don't maybe necessarily can name the notes A, B, C, D, E, but you remember just the, like Happy Birthday to You. You remember it quickly. Yeah. There's the people that can hear these notes and tell you what the notes are, but they don't know what, if you play C, E, G. Yeah. That's a chord. They don't know that. It's like they'll say that's C, E, G. And the other people say, I'm not sure what that is, but that's a major triad. And there's other people say, well, that's a C major triad, and so on. So there's all different strengths, and to me that's like one of the most, especially for jazz musicians, right? The idea of playing jazz is that I know you play this way, like thoroughly. You hear something and you play it. It's as simple as that. You dream it up and you play it. If you don't, the the best lesson I ever got in my life. I never took a jazz course, but I learned like from jazz
You learned on the
musicians,
bandstand.
right, on the bandstand, and the only training I had was classical. So I was on the bandstand with this guy named Kenny Deverne, and he's a clarinet player, one of the best musicians I've ever played with in my life. And before I took my guitar out of the case, he didn't know me from Adam. We had a quick rehearsal. Before I took it out of the case, he said to me, "If you don't hear it, don't play it." Yes,
wow.
And then he said, "There are no stars in this band." And he pointed to each of us like it was just a trio or a quartet. He said, "You're not the star. You're not the star. It's a group."
Wow.
Yeah. And then the other thing I learned from him was, I think you probably know, like I'm a big, as you are, a big advocate of knowing the melody, like playing off the melody as much or if not more than the chords. Like, I mean, there are jazz musicians who know the chords to a tune and not know the melody and play off the chords, and it's got nothing to do with the song.
Yeah, right.
And I learned that lesson from him, like, because we were playing, because he was a swing musician, and we were playing tunes that I'd not only never heard, I'd never even heard of, like tunes from the 30s and stuff. But they're easy to follow, you know, like we both had good ears, the bass player and I, and so we could follow, you know, you just play the melody and it's pretty evident what the chords are going to be.
Right.
So, you know, I played with him a few times, like a week at a time. And on one of those visits to here, it was just at the Chateau Laurier when they used to have sort of the equivalent of the Bourbon Street here. You know,
right.
And we're at lunch. He had brought me a clarinet, actually, you know, because he knew I was a composer. He said, "Here, I bought this in a pawn shop," and he gave it to me. He says, "You know, check it out." Anyway, he says, "You know, I hear what you're doing." He says, "You know, it's good." You know, he says, "But if you took the time to learn the melodies to these tunes, it would make a big difference."
Wow.
And sure enough, and now it's like that's my modus operandi. Like,
huge difference.
I wish I'd known that a lot earlier.
There was in Edmonton, I did all my first gigs with this guy named Bob Stroop, who was a trombone player. He used to play with Woody Herman's band. But he also played tenor, which he read in concert pitch, and vibes, and a bit of flute, and anything to get a gig, right? Yeah. But a beautiful, you know, trombone player, very, very, you know, that old sort of Dorsey, so he really knew a million tunes. So he taught all the horn players in Grant MacEwan College their improv course. With the guitar players, we all got put with the guitar teacher, this guy Bobby Cairns. And Bobby had gone to Berkeley, and he was all about the scales and the chords a lot, right? Yeah. It's all about a lot of things, but that was definitely, you learned the grammar of that. Bob Stroop, from what I could tell, never talked about that stuff with the horn players. And I can remember at the time, you know, when you're 19 years old and you get shown chord scale relationships and you can kind of hear resolutions of guide tones, you go, well, this is clearly the answer to how to learn how to play on the changes, right? And then I'd go to his course and he'd, Sweet Georgia Brown, and he'd show it to them, like on the instruments. And then after they'd played it, for a half an hour together, he'd go up to the board and write it out. And he'd go, "I want it in these 4 keys for next week." Yeah. The melody. Yeah. And that was it. And I thought, he's mad. You know, it's like 25 years later, I began to, you learn enough of those melodies and they contain all the information about the harmony.
That's what Lee Collins is all about. Play off the melody. He's got even, like, I think a 10-step sort of...
For like an algorithm.
Yeah. Like, you know, getting further and further away. And there's someone, like somebody asked him, like, how long does it take you to learn a tune? 20 years.
Sounds about right. Yeah. Wow. And to learn it to his satisfaction must be.
Playing off the melody. I remember hearing him play here too, like about 5 years ago. And he had a group with him, just bass and drums. And the bass player was taking a solo, and I don't think he liked what he was hearing, because it wasn't very melodic. So he started, you know how, like, usually when somebody takes a bass solo, somebody might 50-50 chance might accompany him with chords behind it, or they would just might. So obviously he didn't have a chord instrument. So what does he do? He starts singing the melody behind the bass.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
But that's the way I was taught too. Like in a way, like now that I think of it, I wasn't taught that. It's funny. It's like, I guess it's a sort of a contradiction, but the way I was taught when I was young was to improvise, always have the melody going on in your head. Always play out, it's always going on. Remember we talked about the cycle?
Yeah.
You're talking about the cycle. It's not so much the chords, but
it isn't the chords.
It's the melody.
Yeah. Or the chords wouldn't be there in the first place if the melody hadn't necessitated them.
Yeah.
And that's why you can change the chords.
Yeah.
And you still haven't changed the tune.
Yeah.
But you change that melody and you are changing the song.
But, and you can copyright the melody, but you can't copyright the chords.
Yeah, that's actually maybe there's some wisdom in that.
Yeah.
But I just am realizing now I better get rolling because I've got to go.
You got to go record
some tunes.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. But thank you so much, Roddy.
That's been a pleasure.
I'll edit this down to the most entertaining 8 minutes you've ever heard in your life. Roddy Elias, thank you so much. And